Good evening, everyone. Before the stories begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. The more you engage, the more these chilling tales will return to your feed. Now, let's step into the dark together. I learned something unsettling the year I turned 30, and it is this. You can live beside someone for years, trust them completely, and still never know which version of you they are quietly studying. The version they care about is not who you are as a person. It is who you are when no one else is watching. The version of you that exists on a schedule. I was living alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Tempe, Arizona, working as a remote account analyst for a medical billing company. My days were repetitive in a way that felt safe. I woke up at 6:30, showered, brewed coffee, and logged in by 7. Lunch was always around noon. I went for a run at 5:30 most evenings, took the same loop through the neighborhood, and was usually back inside by 6:15. I liked routine. Routine made me feel invisible, and invisibility felt like protection. The only person who really broke that pattern was my downstairs neighbor, Ryan. Ryan was in his mid-30s, worked maintenance for the complex, and had been there longer than almost anyone. He was the kind of guy you trust without thinking about it. Calm voice, friendly smile. Always had his phone flashlight out helping someone unlock their door or jump a dead car battery. He knew everyone. He knew who was moving out, who just had a baby, who worked night shifts. At the time, I thought that meant he was reliable. Looking back, I understand it meant he was observant. We talked almost every day in passing. Nothing deep, small stuff. Complaints about the heat, jokes about the broken elevator. He knew I worked from home. I knew he had access to master keys. None of that registered as dangerous because nothing bad had ever happened. That is how betrayal works. It waits for comfort to do the heavy lifting. The first thing that changed was so small, I dismissed it immediately. One afternoon, Ryan knocked on my door just as I was finishing a meeting. When I opened it, he smiled and said he was checking smoke detectors unit by unit because management wanted updated logs. He stepped inside, scanned the ceiling, pressed a button, and filled out a clipboard. It took maybe 2 minutes. Before leaving, he casually said he would be back later in the week because some units needed second checks. After he left, I realized something felt off. Not because of what he did, but because of what he said while standing in my living room. He mentioned that I usually ran around 5:30 but had skipped it that day. He laughed and said everyone deserves a break. I remember standing there after the door closed, coffee mug in my hand, thinking about how strange it was that he noticed. Then I told myself I was being paranoid. We saw each other often. Of course he would notice. That explanation was comforting and I accepted it. Over the next few weeks, little comments kept landing that way. He would mention when my lights went out earlier than usual. He joked about my groceries when I brought in bags. He asked if I was feeling better after a cough he heard through the floor one night. None of it was aggressive. None of it crossed a clear line, but it slowly taught me that I was more visible than I thought. The real shift happened on a Tuesday night. I had stayed late on a project and missed my run again. Around 7, I went downstairs to check my mail and ran into Ryan by the laundry room. He looked surprised to see me. Not startled, just surprised, like I had stepped out of character. He said he thought I would be out running by then. I laughed it off and told him work was killing me. He nodded slowly, like he was updating something in his head, and said I should take care of myself. His tone was normal. His eyes were not. That night, I slept poorly. I woke up twice thinking I heard movement in the hallway outside my door. Each time, nothing was there. I told myself apartment buildings make noise. Pipes shift. People walk. It was normal. 2 days later, I found my bathroom cabinet open. I am meticulous about my space. It is a control thing. When something is moved, I know. The cabinet door was not wide open. It was cracked, just enough that the light caught the edge of the mirror inside. At first I assumed I had left it that way. Then I noticed my prescription bottle was turned differently than I keep it. Label facing out instead of sideways. I stood there longer than I want to admit, staring at it, waiting for a logical explanation to arrive. Eventually, I told myself I must have grabbed something in a hurry that morning. Stress messes with memory. That is what I told myself. Later that night, Ryan texted me. I had given him my number months earlier in case of maintenance emergencies. The text was casual. He asked if I was okay. Said he heard a loud bang upstairs earlier and wanted to make sure I had not fallen or hurt yourself. I stared at the screen, confused. I had not dropped anything. I had been sitting at my desk most of the evening. I replied that everything was fine. He responded with a thumbs up emoji and nothing else. The next morning, my bedroom window was unlocked. I know that sounds like something anyone could forget, but I never open that window. Ever. It faces the courtyard and sits low enough that someone could reach it from the outside with effort. I always keep it locked. Always. I stood there holding the latch, feeling something cold move through my chest. I checked the rest of the apartment. Doors locked. Nothing missing. No signs of forced entry. Just the window. That was the moment I started documenting things, quietly, without telling anyone. I took photos of how I left rooms. I wrote down times. I noted when I left and when I returned. I did not accuse. I did not confront. Something told me that asking questions would make things worse. 3 nights later, my phone buzzed at 1:30 in the morning. It was Ryan again. He apologized for texting so late and said he just wanted to check in. He said he noticed my lights were still on and wondered if I was feeling anxious. He said sometimes he had trouble sleeping too. I did not reply. The next day, I contacted the leasing office and asked if there had been any recent reports of break-ins or key misuse. They assured me there had not. They told me Ryan was trusted, long-term, and well-liked. They suggested I was probably stressed from working too much. That afternoon, I came home early from a grocery run and noticed something I had not before. The small maintenance storage room near the stairwell had its door cracked open. Inside, I could see shelves of supplies and a desk with a corkboard mounted above it. Pinned to that board were notes, schedules, printed floor plans, and taped in the corner, folded slightly, was a piece of paper with my apartment number written at the top. I did not step inside. I did not make a sound. I took a photo from where I stood and walked back upstairs, my legs shaking so badly I had to sit on the floor after locking my door. That night, someone tried my handle. Not aggressively, not shaking it, just a slow turn, like someone testing if I remembered to lock it. I did not sleep at all. By morning, I understood the worst part. Whatever was happening had not just started. It had been building quietly, patiently, using trust as cover, and whoever was behind it knew exactly when I would be awake, when I would be gone, and how long they had before I noticed something was wrong. And I realized, with a clarity that made my stomach drop, that I had never been invisible at all. I had been predictable. By the next morning, I was running on adrenaline and fear instead of sleep. Everything felt louder than it should have. The hum of the refrigerator, the click of my laptop keys, the footsteps in the hallway outside my door that I now noticed every single time. I kept replaying the image of that paper with my apartment number taped to the corkboard, trying to convince myself there was some harmless explanation. Maybe it was part of his job. Maybe he tracked maintenance requests that way. But deep down, I already knew that was a lie I was telling myself because the truth was worse. I called in sick to work and spent the morning packing a bag just in case. I did not know where I would go yet, but I knew I could not stay without answers. Before leaving, I checked my apartment one more time, moving slowly, opening every door, every closet, every cabinet. Everything looked normal. That almost made it worse. As I was zipping my bag, my phone buzzed again. It was Ryan. He said he noticed I had not logged into work yet and asked if everything was okay. That was when the full weight of it hit me. He was not just watching my physical movements. He was tracking my online ones too. I had never told him my schedule in detail. He had built it himself. I did not respond. I grabbed my bag and left. Instead of going to a friend or a hotel, I drove to a public library across town, somewhere quiet but full of people. I sat there for hours scrolling through the photos I had taken over the past week. The cabinet, the window, the storage room. The timestamps told a story I had been too scared to read until now. Things had been moved only on days I went for runs, only during the windows when I was reliably gone. He was not guessing. Late that afternoon, I decided I needed proof, not just fear. I went back to the apartment complex, parked down the street, and waited. I watched from my car as residents came and went. I watched Ryan move through the courtyard, clipboard in hand, smiling at people, helping someone carry groceries. He looked exactly like the man everyone trusted. Around 6, I saw him enter the maintenance building. I waited 5 minutes, then walked toward it, keeping my head down. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was quiet. The corkboard was still there. My apartment number was still pinned in the corner. But now there was more. Below it was a handwritten list. My name, my unit number, notes beside it, runs at 5:30, lights out by 11, works from home weekdays, no regular visitors. At the bottom of the page was a new line. Not home today. My chest tightened so hard it felt like my ribs were collapsing inward. That meant he knew. He knew I was gone. He knew I was not following the pattern anymore. Behind me, the door closed. Ryan's voice was calm when he spoke. He said I startled him and asked what I was doing in there. I turned slowly and saw him standing between me and the exit, clipboard tucked under his arm like a shield. Up close, his smile looked practiced, like it had been used many times before in situations that demanded it. I told him I was looking for the leasing office. I told him I thought this was the way. He nodded like that made sense. Then he glanced at the board behind me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed like someone disappointed by an inconvenience. He said I was not supposed to see that yet. The word yet landed heavier than anything else he could have said. He started talking then, not angrily, not threateningly, but casually, like we were discussing a scheduling error. He said he liked order. He said people who follow routines are easy to care about because you know when they are safe. He said he had been making sure nothing happened to me. I asked him if that was why my window was unlocked. His smile faded slightly. He said sometimes people forget things and it helps to check. He said it was his job to make sure residents were secure. He stepped closer as he said it, lowering his voice, telling me I should go back upstairs and rest, that I looked tired. I moved toward the door. He reached out, not grabbing me, just touching my arm lightly, guiding me back like a suggestion. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I told him to let me go. I told him I was leaving. He said I was overreacting. That was when another voice broke the moment. Someone outside calling his name. A resident asking for help with a car. Ryan stepped back immediately, smile returning, mask sliding back into place. He told me we would talk later and opened the door for me. I walked out without looking back. I went straight to the police. This time I did not explain how I felt. I showed them everything. The photos, the messages, the notes, the timeline. When officers returned with me to the complex, Ryan was gone. The maintenance room was locked. The corkboard was empty. Management told police he had called in earlier saying he had a family emergency. They said he had turned in his keys. They said he had been a model employee for years. Nothing was missing from my apartment. There were no fingerprints, no forced entry, no crime that fit neatly into a report. I moved out 2 weeks later. Even now, years later, I still catch myself checking locks twice. I still vary my routines. I still feel a chill when someone notices details about my day that I did not tell them. Because the most terrifying part was not that someone wanted to hurt me. It was that someone had decided to take responsibility for me without my consent. And I never found out what would have happened if I had followed my schedule one more week. The most disturbing part of this story is not what happened to me. It is how long it took me to realize that my life had been quietly rerouted by someone who claimed they were protecting me. By the time I understood the truth, there was no confrontation left to have. The decisions had already been made. The damage had already been accepted by everyone except me. I was 28 and living in Columbus, Ohio, working my first real corporate job after college. I was the kind of person who avoided conflict whenever possible. I did my work, kept my head down, and trusted that effort would speak louder than personality. That mindset is what made me vulnerable. Not weak, just cooperative in ways I did not yet understand could be exploited. My older sister, Lauren, helped me get the job. She had been at the company for years and was well liked. Confident. Organized. The kind of employee managers relied on when things got complicated. When she told me she had put in a good word for me, I was grateful in the way younger siblings often are. I thought she was looking out for me. I did not question how much access that gave her to my professional life. At first, everything was fine. I worked in a different department on a different floor. We had separate teams. We barely crossed paths during the day. At home, though, things felt different. Lauren asked a lot of questions. How was work? Who was my manager? Did I feel overwhelmed? Did I feel confident speaking up in meetings? I assumed it was normal sibling concern. She had always been protective. The first crack appeared during my 3-month review. My manager praised my performance but said there were concerns about my confidence. He said I seemed hesitant. He said I sometimes deferred too quickly. I nodded along, embarrassed, but not shocked. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. He said he knew I struggled with anxiety, and that they were trying to be supportive. I asked him what he meant. He hesitated and said he did not want to breach confidentiality, but he assured me that the company valued transparency and accommodation. He said I should feel safe taking time when needed. I left that meeting in a fog. I had never disclosed anxiety to my employer. Not formally. Not informally. I had never asked for accommodations. I did not even talk about it at work. The only person who knew about my past panic attacks was Lauren. She had been there years earlier when I went through a rough patch after college. That night, I asked her about it. She laughed lightly and said she might have mentioned it in passing. She said she framed it as context. She said it was better they knew so they would not push me too hard. She told me I should be thanking her. Something in her tone made it clear the conversation was over. Over the next few months, things shifted in subtle ways. My workload changed. I was excluded from higher pressure projects. My manager spoke to me differently, slower, more carefully, like he was choosing each word to avoid setting something off. During meetings, when I started to speak, he would often cut in gently and say he would handle it. I felt myself shrinking. When I brought it up to Lauren, she told me I was imagining things. She said this was what support looked like. She said I had always needed someone to advocate for me. I started to doubt my own perceptions because it was easier than accepting what they implied. The breaking point came during a promotion cycle. I had been unofficially told I was a strong candidate. I had put in long hours. I had taken on responsibilities above my role. When the promotions were announced, my name was not on the list. Instead, I was reassigned to a less visible position under the justification of reducing stress. I requested a meeting with my manager and HR. That meeting is burned into my memory. They spoke kindly. They praised my work. Then they explained that based on internal feedback, it was decided I was not ready for increased responsibility. They cited emotional fragility, difficulty handling pressure, a need for ongoing support. They showed me notes. The notes were detailed, intimate, personal. They referenced panic attacks I had never disclosed at work, thoughts I had shared privately years ago, fears I barely remembered saying out loud. I asked who provided that information. There was a pause. Then my manager said my sister had been advocating on my behalf since before I was hired. He said she was concerned about my well-being. He said she wanted to make sure I was not put in situations that could harm me. I drove home shaking. When I confronted Lauren, she did not deny it. She told me someone had to be realistic. She said I would have burned out. She said she had seen me spiral before and she was not going to let it happen again. She said I should be grateful she saved me from myself. I asked her why she never told me. She said I would have argued. That was when I realized the betrayal was not impulsive. It was intentional, sustained, carefully justified. She had spoken for me in rooms I was not allowed into. She had shaped how others saw me while convincing herself it was love. And the worst part was that everyone believed her, because she sounded reasonable. After that night, I stopped sleeping normally. Not because of fear in the traditional sense, but because something heavier had settled in. It felt like grief, except no one had died. What I lost was harder to explain. I had lost ownership of myself, and everyone around me seemed perfectly comfortable with that. The next week at work was unbearable. People treated me gently now, not cruelly, not dismissively, gently. Coworkers checked in on me with careful smiles. My manager asked if I was feeling okay before assigning even minor tasks. Every interaction reinforced the same message. I was fragile. I had been labeled, documented, and archived as a risk. I tried to correct it. I scheduled meetings. I clarified. I explained that my sister had shared outdated private information without my consent. HR listened politely and took notes. Then they explained that the documentation had already been factored into long-term development plans. They said reversing course could be destabilizing. They said consistency was important for my well-being. They said well-being the way someone says policy. When I asked to have the notes removed from my file, they said that was not possible. They were internal records, historical context. I asked if I could submit my own statement. They said I could, but it would be added alongside the existing material, not replace it. That was the moment I understood there was no version of this where I won. At home, Lauren acted like nothing had changed. She cooked dinner. She asked about my day. She told me she was proud of how maturely I was handling things. When I told her I felt trapped, she looked genuinely confused. She said I always struggled with big emotions. She said I was rewriting the past because I was embarrassed. I started recording our conversations, quietly, on my phone. Not because I planned to use them legally, but because I needed proof for myself that I was not imagining the way she twisted everything back toward concern. In every recording, she sounded calm, measured, loving, and in every one I sounded defensive, emotional, unstable. Listening to them later made my stomach turn. The final blow came 3 months later. I was called into another meeting. This time, HR and upper management were present. They told me they had decided to place me on a long-term support track. Reduced responsibilities, no leadership path, limited advancement. They framed it as protection, sustainability, care. They said my sister had been instrumental in helping them understand my needs. I realized then that this was not about my job anymore. This was about control. That night I packed my things and left. I did not tell Lauren where I was going. I stayed with a friend across town and started applying for new jobs immediately. I did not list my current manager as a reference. I did not list the company at all. Weeks passed, then months. Every interview went well until the background checks. One recruiter finally leveled with me. She said there were internal flags. Nothing criminal, nothing explicit, just concerns about emotional reliability. She said it was unusual how consistent the feedback was across references. I knew exactly where it was coming from. Lauren had followed me. Not physically, professionally. She had framed herself as my advocate everywhere I had ever been. She had inserted herself early, quietly, always under the guise of care. She had built a version of me that others trusted more than my own words. I confronted her one last time. I told her she had destroyed my career, my credibility, my sense of autonomy. She cried. She told me she did what she had to. She said if I could not see that, then I was proving her right. She said one day I would thank her. I cut contact after that. I moved out of state. I took a job far below my qualifications at a small company where no one knew my name. I did not tell my family why. I let them believe we drifted apart naturally. It was easier than explaining a betrayal that wore the face of love. Years later, I am doing better. Not because things were fixed, but because I stopped fighting to be seen the way I used to be. I learned to exist quietly again, to keep things to myself, to never let anyone speak for me without my permission. Sometimes, though, when someone describes me in a way that feels slightly off, I feel that same drop in my chest, that same realization. Because the most devastating betrayals are not violent, they are administrative, they are polite, and they leave no evidence that anyone did anything wrong. The first time I signed something without reading it, nothing bad happened. That is important to understand because it trained me. It made the next signatures easier. It made trust feel efficient instead of dangerous. And by the time the documents actually mattered, my instinct was already gone. It started during a period where everything felt slightly off, but not broken. Days blurred together. Concentration slipped in small ways that were easy to excuse. I would lose words mid-sentence, forget why I opened a tab on my computer, reread the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing it. Nothing alarming enough to scare me, just enough to make me tired of explaining myself. Megan noticed before I did. Or at least she said she did. She started reminding me of things, appointments, emails, deadlines. At first it felt helpful, then it became expected. If I forgot something, she already had it handled. If I hesitated, she filled in the gaps. When people thanked her for being so organized, I felt relieved instead of threatened. I thought that was what partnership looked like when one person was struggling. Paperwork became part of the routine. It was never framed as a big deal. Forms were slid across the table while dinner cooked or while I was half focused on something else. She would explain them quickly, confidently, always emphasizing how temporary or minor they were. Authorization to speak to a doctor, permission to handle billing, a release so she could follow up without me being present. She never hovered. She never pressured. She simply waited with a pen. On days when my head felt clear, I skimmed. On days when it didn't, I signed. Nothing changed immediately. That made it worse. Appointments continued. Work continued. Life continued. But slowly, conversations started happening without me. I would arrive at a doctor visit and be told a decision had already been made. A medication adjusted. A follow-up scheduled. When I asked why, Megan would explain it like it was obvious. She would say I agreed last time, that I had been exhausted, that I asked her to decide. I didn't remember doing that, but memory is a fragile thing when someone else sounds confident. At work, my responsibilities shifted quietly. I didn't get pulled into a room or given bad news. Tasks were reassigned gently. Deadlines softened, meetings shortened. When I asked my manager about it, he said it was temporary. He said he understood I was dealing with some things. He said documentation supported a lighter load. I asked what documentation. He assumed I knew. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. The first moment of real panic came when I tried to access an account I had used for years and couldn't. I assumed it was a technical issue. Megan told me she had updated access because of security concerns. She said it was easier if she managed it until things stabilized. She said I agreed. I didn't argue. I told myself this was still normal. The second moment came when an email landed in my inbox that I didn't recognize. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't alarming. It was polite, professional. It thanked us for submitting completed documents and confirmed they were being processed. Attached were copies. I opened one. It was a form authorizing medical decision-making in the event of impaired judgment. My name was printed at the top. My signature was at the bottom. The date was from a week I barely remembered. A week I had spent in short stretches of sleep and long stretches of quiet while Megan handled things. I scrolled. There were more. Financial authorization, employment communication consent, asset management language I didn't fully understand but recognized enough to know it mattered. Every document carried my signature. Every one had been notarized. Everyone was complete. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear exactly, but the sudden awareness that fear should have arrived sooner. When I brought it up, Megan didn't panic. She didn't deny anything. She looked tired. She told me this was exactly why she had stepped in. She said I had been overwhelmed. She said I asked her to take care of it. When I told her I didn't remember agreeing to any of this, she nodded slowly and said memory lapses were part of the problem. From that point forward, every attempt to push back became evidence. If I questioned a decision, it was framed as stress. If I got upset, it was emotional instability. If I demanded control back, it was proof I wasn't ready for it. She never said these things harshly. She said them like facts. At the next appointment, I tried to speak directly. I corrected something she said. The doctor listened, nodded, and then gently turned back to her. He referenced notes, patterns, reported concerns. He said support structures were already in place. I asked when those notes were written. He said over time. Driving home, it hit me that the betrayal wasn't a single moment or document. It was cumulative, layered, built slowly while I was cooperative, tired, and trying not to be difficult. She hadn't tricked me. She had prepared me. That night, I searched for the original copies of everything I had signed. They were gone, digitized, filed, accepted. There was nothing to undo yet, nothing dramatic to fight against. Just a growing understanding that I was no longer the primary voice attached to my own name. And the worst part was realizing that every signature looked willing. Because it was. The shift happened so gradually that I did not notice it until other people reacted to it before I did. That was how I knew it was real. Not because Megan said so, not because a document existed, but because the world had already adjusted around a version of me I did not recognize. The first sign was my job. I was called into a meeting that I had not scheduled and did not know about until Megan reminded me that morning. She said it was just a check-in. She said she would come with me so I did not get overwhelmed. When we sat down, HR was already there. They spoke carefully, slowly. They thanked me for being cooperative. They explained that based on medical documentation and internal discussions, my role would be changing permanently, not temporarily, permanently. I interrupted and said that was not what we had discussed. HR looked confused. My manager avoided my eyes. Megan placed her hand lightly on my arm and told them I had been anxious lately. She said big conversations were hard for me. They nodded. They showed me a packet. Every page referenced my consent, my agreement, my acknowledgement that I was not in a position to handle increased responsibility. There were email chains attached, updates, follow-ups, all sent on my behalf. When I asked how this could happen without me approving it, HR said gently that I had. They said my representative had been very thorough. They said it was clear this was done in my best interest. That phrase followed me everywhere after that. Best interest. At home, I tried to access more accounts and realized I could not. Banking, insurance, even a utility login. Megan told me she had consolidated everything to reduce stress. She said too many decisions were bad for my recovery. She said I needed structure. I asked her how far this went. She told me I was getting agitated and should sit down. That night I did not sleep. Not because of fear, but because of calculation. I replayed every moment from the past year, every time I had deferred, every time I had signed something because I wanted the conversation to end. I tried to remember exact wording, exact days. The problem was that nothing stood out. There was no dramatic deception, no forged signature, no forced hand, just my own handwriting. The next morning I tried to call a lawyer. The consultation ended quickly, not because they didn't believe me, but because there was nothing to contest. The documents were valid. The authority had been granted voluntarily. The timeline showed no coercion. The lawyer asked if there was a history of cognitive issues or stress-related impairment. I hung up without answering. I tried a second lawyer. Same result. The third one was honest. He said even if I felt manipulated, manipulation was not illegal. He said people sign things every day they later regret. He said the system relies on documentation, not intent. He asked if I had proof I was incapable of consenting at the time. I did not. The final blow came when I received a letter confirming the execution of a trust. I had never discussed a trust. It outlined asset control, decision-making hierarchy, and contingency planning. Megan was listed as primary authority. I was listed as beneficiary with restrictions. The language was clinical, careful, airtight. The date on the signature was one of the worst migraine days I could remember. I confronted Megan one last time. I told her I was taking control back. I told her I was revoking everything. I told her she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She did not raise her voice. She told me revocation required evaluation. She told me doctors needed to confirm capacity. She told me pushing too hard would only reinforce concerns. She said she was trying to help me avoid hurting myself. That was when I understood the trap. Any attempt to escape would be framed as instability. Any anger would be labeled emotional volatility. Any clarity would be questioned because it arrived too late. I stopped arguing. Weeks later, I was informed that it would be better if I stayed with my parents for a while. Megan said it was her idea. My parents said they agreed. Everyone said it was temporary. I packed a bag. I left my own house without a fight because I had learned what resistance cost. The house was sold 6 months later. I did not sign the final papers. Megan did. On my behalf, perfectly legally. I live quietly now. I work a job that does not require trust. I keep my life small enough that no one feels the need to manage it for me. I read every word of everything I sign, even menus, even delivery receipts, even things that do not matter. Because what haunts me is not that she betrayed me. It is that the system agreed with her. And somewhere, in a file that will outlive me, there is a version of my life where I consented to disappearing. The first person who suggested something was wrong with me was someone I trusted more than myself. That detail matters because if it had come from anyone else, I would have laughed it off. Instead, I listened. And listening turned out to be the most dangerous thing I could have done. It started as a joke, or at least that is how it sounded. We were sitting on my couch talking about nothing important, when he paused mid-sentence and asked if I had slept well lately. I said I thought so. He nodded slowly and said I had seemed distracted. Not in a bad way, just different. I asked what he meant, and he shrugged, smiling, saying it was probably nothing. That probably nothing followed me for days. He started checking in more often, asking how I was feeling, asking if work was overwhelming, asking if I felt stressed. The questions were casual, but they stacked. I found myself answering them carefully, the way you do when you don't want to sound dramatic or ungrateful. When I asked why he was suddenly so concerned, he said he cared about me. He said he knew me better than anyone. He said sometimes people don't notice when they're slipping. I remember laughing and telling him I wasn't slipping anywhere. He didn't argue. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. After that, little comments started appearing in conversation. He mentioned I repeated myself sometimes. He said I forgot details he remembered clearly. When I disagreed, he didn't push back aggressively. He just looked thoughtful and said, "Memory can be tricky when stress builds up." I started paying attention to myself in ways I never had before. Replaying conversations, checking messages to make sure I hadn't imagined them, counting how often I forgot small things like where I left my phone or what day it was. All normal human behavior. But once it's framed a certain way, nothing feels normal anymore. The first time someone else echoed his concern, my stomach dropped. A coworker asked if I was doing okay, said I seemed tired lately, said my friend had mentioned I'd been under a lot of pressure. I asked what exactly he had said, but the coworker waved it off, saying it wasn't a big deal, just concern. That word again, concern. I confronted my friend that night. I told him it bothered me that he was talking about me to other people. He looked genuinely surprised. He said he only mentioned it because he was worried. He said he thought people should look out for each other. He apologized if it crossed a line. Then he asked if my reaction felt bigger than it needed to be. That question stuck. After that, my world began to tilt in small, deliberate ways. Friends asked how I was holding up. Family members called more often. Conversations ended with reminders to rest, to slow down, to take care of myself. Everyone sounded kind. Everyone sounded concerned. No one sounded accusatory, which meant there was nothing to fight. I asked him directly one night if he thought something was wrong with me. He hesitated. That hesitation did more damage than any accusation could have. He said he didn't want to label anything. He said labels can be harmful. He said he just wanted me to be safe. Safe from what, I asked. He said sometimes people don't realize they're spiraling until they hit the bottom. That night, I barely slept. Not because I believed him completely, but because I couldn't fully dismiss him either. He had known me for years. He had seen me at my worst before. What if he was noticing something I wasn't? That doubt became a crack. Everything else slipped through. I started second-guessing my reactions. When I got annoyed, I wondered if it was disproportionate. When I got sad, I wondered if it lingered too long. When I got angry, I wondered if it was justified. The more I questioned myself, the more calm and grounded he seemed by comparison. He started offering solutions: therapy, time off, journaling, tracking moods. He framed everything as optional, but he brought it up often enough that declining felt irresponsible. When I said I didn't think I needed it, he said it couldn't hurt. When I said I was fine, he said that was exactly what people say before they aren't. At some point, he began speaking to others without telling me, not dramatically, quietly. He checked in with my family. He reached out to a therapist he knew. He spoke to my employer under the guise of flexibility and support. He always positioned himself as the helper, the bridge, the responsible one. By the time I realized how far it had gone, I was already behind the version of me he had described. The scariest part was that nothing he said was entirely false. I did forget things sometimes. I was stressed. I had been tired. I had questioned myself more than usual. He didn't invent problems. He curated them. And the more people adjusted their behavior around me, the more real his version of events felt. Doors closed softly. Expectations lowered. Conversations shifted. I began to feel like I was watching my own reputation drift away without any moment I could point to and say that was the lie. One night, after a long conversation where he gently suggested I take a step back from certain responsibilities, I looked at him and realized something that made my chest tighten. He wasn't afraid for me. He was certain about me. And certainty, when it's wrong, is terrifying. The moment I understood something was truly wrong was not dramatic. There was no argument, no accusation, no sudden reveal. It happened quietly, during a conversation that felt almost rehearsed. He asked me to sit down with him one evening because he was worried about how things were progressing. He said people were starting to ask questions. He said he was trying to protect me from consequences I might not be able to undo. He spoke slowly, carefully, like someone explaining a difficult truth to a child. He suggested that maybe I take a temporary step back from making big decisions. Just for a while. Just until things stabilized. He said it would show maturity, responsibility, awareness. I asked him who else knew about this. He listed names, family members, a couple of coworkers, someone from HR, a therapist he said he had consulted informally for advice. Not about diagnosing me, he clarified, but about how to help someone who might not recognize they were struggling. I felt my stomach turn cold. I asked him why he never came to me first before doing all of that. He said he tried. He said I got defensive. He said defensiveness was often part of the pattern. I realized then that the trap was self-sustaining. Any objection I raised fit neatly into the narrative he had already built. Disagreement became denial. Anger became instability. Calm insistence became quiet resistance. That night, instead of arguing, I did something different. I agreed with him. I told him he might be right. I said I wanted help. I said I would talk to a professional on my own terms. The relief on his face was immediate and unsettling. He hugged me and told me he was proud of me for being brave. The next day, I scheduled an appointment with a licensed clinical psychologist I found myself. I told no one except him. I wanted to see what happened when the story met someone who was trained to recognize manipulation. I went in prepared to be told I was in denial. Instead, the therapist asked me to describe my relationships, my support system, who had first expressed concern and how it escalated. She listened without interrupting, occasionally asking me to clarify timelines or language. When I finished, she sat back and asked a question that shifted everything. She asked if my friend benefited in any way from positioning himself as my caretaker. No one had asked me that before. Over the next few sessions, she helped me map the pattern, the gradual erosion of self-trust, the way my normal reactions were reframed as symptoms, the way concern had been used to justify control. She explained how projection and savior complexes can look indistinguishable from care when wrapped in confidence. She told me very clearly that what I described was not evidence of a breakdown. It was evidence of gaslighting. Hearing the word out loud felt like oxygen rushing back into my chest. She encouraged me to bring documentation, messages, emails, anything where his concern escalated without concrete incidents. When we laid it all out, the progression was unmistakable. His certainty had grown faster than any actual issue. His interventions had created the very instability he claimed to be preventing. She helped me draft a message. Not an accusation, a boundary. I sent it to my family first, explaining calmly that I was working with a professional and asking them to pause any conversations about my mental health unless I initiated them. I attached a brief note from the therapist confirming I was competent and not in crisis. Then I sent a similar message to my employer. The response was immediate. HR apologized. They admitted decisions had been influenced by third-party concerns without direct verification. They reinstated responsibilities. They documented the correction formally. The tone shifted back to normal within days. Finally, I confronted him. I told him I was fine. I told him I had professional confirmation. I told him to stop speaking about me to others. I did not argue. I did not explain myself beyond that. For the first time, he became defensive. He said the therapist was enabling me. He said professionals get things wrong all the time. He said I was pushing away the one person who truly cared. I told him that caring does not require control. That was the end. I cut contact completely. The aftermath was strange in its quietness. People adjusted back. Conversations normalized. The world slowly realigned around the version of me I recognized again. There was no dramatic fallout, no public apology, just distance. Months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had tried the same thing with someone else. This time, it was caught earlier. Patterns were noticed. Boundaries were enforced. I did not feel vindicated. I felt relieved. Because the most terrifying part of the whole experience was not that I almost lost myself. It was how close I came to believing that losing myself would have been the responsible thing to do. I still trust people. I just trust myself first now. And that made all the difference. The email that proved I was innocent arrived on a Tuesday morning, and it should have been the end of everything. It was brief, professional, written in the kind of neutral language that carries weight precisely because it avoids emotion. It stated clearly that no wrongdoing had been found, that allegations could not be substantiated, and that the matter was considered closed. I read it 3 times before it sank in. Closed. I sat there waiting for relief to show up, waiting for the tightness in my chest to ease, waiting for the feeling that my life had been handed back to me. None of that happened. What I felt instead was a dull awareness that something had already moved on without me. The investigation had lasted just over 4 months. 4 months of careful questions, of people watching how I reacted instead of listening to what I said. 4 months where everything I did felt provisional, temporary, subject to interpretation. I complied with every request. I answered everything honestly. I never raised my voice. I never pushed back. Because I had been told cooperation mattered. Someone I trusted had initiated it. That part was never put in writing. What was put in writing was that I was cleared. At work, my manager called me into his office to tell me the good news in person. He smiled. He said he was glad it was over. He said he knew it had been stressful. He said things could get back to normal now. He did not define what normal meant. For the first few days, nothing obvious changed. People greeted me the same way. Meetings happened as scheduled. Emails came through. On the surface, the world behaved correctly. But there was a difference in timing that I noticed before anything else. Replies took longer. Not dramatically longer. Just enough to register. Invitations arrived later than they used to. Conversations ended a little faster. People stopped lingering after meetings to talk about nothing. When I walked into a room, there was sometimes a pause that hadn't been there before, a recalibration that happened too quickly to call out. I told myself I was imagining it. That explanation lasted until I overheard 2 coworkers talking quietly in the break room. They stopped when they noticed me, but not fast enough for me to miss the tone. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't accusatory. It was cautious. Caution is worse. A week later, I applied for a position internally, a lateral move, something that should have been routine. I had the experience. I had the history. I had already spoken informally with the team lead months earlier. At the time, he had encouraged me to apply. This time the rejection came quickly, too quickly. The feedback was polite and vague. They went with someone else. Better fit. Different direction. I asked for clarification and was told it wasn't personal. It never is. Then I noticed that people stopped asking me for favors. No more quick questions. No more requests for help. I had gone from being relied on to being bypassed without explanation. When I offered input in meetings, it was acknowledged but rarely built on. My ideas didn't get challenged. They got set aside. Being argued with would have been better. Outside of work, the shift followed me. Friends canceled plans more often. Not all at once, one by one. Always with reasonable excuses. Family members asked how I was doing in a way that felt rehearsed, careful, like they were checking a box. No one ever mentioned the investigation directly, but I could feel its shape in conversations that stopped short of certain topics. I asked the person who had reported me why they did it. They said they were just being cautious. They said they didn't accuse me of anything specific. They said they had concerns and thought it was better to let professionals decide. They said it wasn't personal. They looked relieved when they said it, like the email had absolved them too. I started searching my name online. Nothing came up. No records, no articles, no traces of the process that had consumed months of my life. Officially, it had never existed. Unofficially, it had changed everything. It lived in pauses, in tone shifts, in the way people glanced at me and then away. One night, I ran into someone I hadn't seen since before everything started. They greeted me warmly, the way people do when they don't know they're supposed to be careful. Halfway through the conversation, their expression changed. Not because of something I said, but because someone else joined us. After that, they grew quieter, more guarded. I went home and sat in the dark for a long time, replaying the day in my head, trying to identify what version of me people were responding to now, the one before the investigation or the one after it. The problem was that I couldn't see the difference from the inside. That was when it occurred to me that being cleared does not erase suspicion. It just removes consequences. And suspicion, once introduced, doesn't need proof to survive. It only needs memory. The first time someone treated me like a risk instead of a person, I didn't notice it happening. I noticed it afterward, when I replayed the interaction and realized how carefully the words had been chosen. Not cold, not unkind, just controlled. It was a small thing. A routine request that used to be handled casually. This time it was routed through a supervisor. No explanation, no announcement, just procedure. When I asked why, the answer was simple. Policy. They said it the way people say weather. From that point on, patterns emerged that were impossible to unsee. I stopped being included in early conversations. I was looped in only after decisions were mostly made. I could still contribute technically, but only within boundaries I had not agreed to. When I asked whether something had changed formally, I was told no. Everything was fine. The matter was closed. Closed matters shouldn't keep echoing. I tried to reset things socially. I reached out to people directly, invited them to grab coffee, suggested catching up. Some accepted. Most didn't. Those who did stayed on safe topics. Nothing personal. Nothing that could be misinterpreted. Conversations felt supervised even when no one else was around. At one point, a friend asked me gently if I was doing okay with everything that happened. I asked what they meant. They paused, then said they didn't want to get into details. They said it was probably better to move forward. Forward from what? I asked. They didn't answer. I started paying attention to the moments where people corrected themselves around me. Half-finished sentences. Phrases that stopped and restarted. A laugh that came too late. I noticed how often someone would look past me during a conversation, like they were checking whether it was safe to continue. I began to wonder how many versions of the story existed, not the official one. That one was clear. I was cleared. Nothing found. End of report. But unofficially, stories don't need conclusions. They just need to be plausible enough to repeat quietly. I asked HR if there was anything on my record, anything lingering, anything that could explain the shift. They assured me there was not. They showed me the file. Clean, minimal, procedural. I believed them. What I didn't believe anymore was that files were where reputations lived. The first time I was excluded outright, it was done kindly. A project I would normally have been part of was assigned elsewhere. When I asked why, my manager said the team wanted to minimize complexity. He said things had been tense lately and they didn't want to add pressure. Pressure for who? I asked. He hesitated before saying everyone. That answer followed me home. I started second-guessing everything I said. Every email, every tone, every expression. Not because I thought I had done something wrong, but because I understood that neutrality could be interpreted in any direction once suspicion existed. Silence could be secrecy. Confidence could be arrogance. Calm could be calculation. There was no safe posture anymore. One evening, I overheard someone say my name followed by the words probably nothing. They didn't know I was there. They weren't whispering. They sounded almost bored, like the topic had already been decided. Probably nothing. That was the phrase that finally broke something in me. Because probably nothing is not innocence. It's uncertainty that has learned to live comfortably. I tried to confront the person who had reported me one last time. Not to accuse them, just to ask whether they understood what had happened afterward. Whether they saw how the air around me had changed. They listened. They nodded. They said they hadn't intended any of that. They said people talk. They said it wasn't their responsibility how others reacted. They said they would still do it again. That was when I realized the damage didn't require malice. It required permission. Permission to doubt. Permission to distance. Permission to treat me differently without saying why. And once that permission had been granted, it didn't expire with the investigation. Months passed. Nothing overt happened. No confrontation. No escalation. Just a steady narrowing. Fewer opportunities. Fewer invitations. A subtle rewriting of my role in rooms I was still physically present in. I wasn't excluded. I was contained. I began looking for work elsewhere. Interviews went well. Background checks came back clean. But there was always a moment near the end where energy shifted, where interest cooled, where follow-ups slowed. No one ever said why. I started to wonder if the person who reported me had spoken to others outside the process. Not directly, casually, framed as concern, framed as context. The kind of thing that sounds responsible instead of destructive. I have no proof of that. What I have is absence. Absence of trust. Absence of ease. Absence of the person I was before everything became conditional. The email still sits in my inbox. The one that says I was cleared. I read it sometimes, like a receipt for something I paid for but never received. Because being cleared is not the same as being restored. And whatever followed me didn't need to accuse me again. It only needed to stay unnamed. The first time I defended her, it felt natural, automatic. Someone questioned her character and I corrected them without hesitation. That is what you do when you love someone. You close ranks. You protect. You don't ask why the question was asked in the first place. I didn't realize then that the act of defending her would become a habit. And habits, once formed, don't require truth to survive. They only require repetition. It started with a comment from a coworker. Casual. Almost playful. They asked how I handled being with someone so close to her boss. I laughed it off and said there was nothing to handle. They shrugged and said people talk. I told them people were bored. When I told her about it later, she looked offended, hurt. She asked why anyone would even say something like that. She said it made her uncomfortable knowing people were speculating about her. I told her I had shut it down, that I didn't believe a word of it. She smiled then, relieved. Grateful. That reaction mattered more to me than the comment itself. After that, the rumors came from different places. Never direct accusations, just sideways remarks. Questions framed as concern. Someone asking if everything was okay between us. Someone else asking if I trusted her. Every time, I answered the same way. Firm, certain. I told them they were wrong. I told them they didn't know her like I did. I told them they were projecting. I meant every word. At home, she never denied anything outright because there was nothing to deny. She didn't panic. She didn't over-explain. She acted wounded that people would think so little of her. She said it made her feel exposed. Misunderstood. I became angrier on her behalf than she ever was. I started cutting people off. Not dramatically. Quietly. I stopped returning calls. I stopped accepting invitations. I unfollowed. I blocked. Anyone who hinted that something wasn't right was suddenly someone who didn't respect our relationship. I told myself I was choosing peace. What I was really choosing was isolation. The next time someone confronted me directly, it was a family member. They didn't accuse her. They accused me of being naive. They said they'd noticed patterns, late nights, unexplained absences, emotional distance. They said they were worried I was being taken advantage of. I didn't let them finish. I told them they were out of line. I told them they were projecting their own failed relationships onto mine. I told them if they couldn't respect her, they couldn't be part of my life. They went quiet after that. So did everyone else. That was when the world narrowed to just us, and I mistook that for intimacy. Looking back, there were signs I dismissed so completely they barely registered. She guarded her phone in ways she never used to. She took calls outside even when it was inconvenient. She had explanations for everything, and the explanations were always reasonable, plausible, exhaustingly normal. I didn't want proof. I wanted consistency. And consistency is easy to fake when someone else is doing the believing for you. The night I finally asked her outright if there was anything I should know, she didn't get defensive. She looked tired. She asked why I was letting other people get into my head. She said she felt like she was being punished for things she hadn't done. She said she didn't feel safe being honest anymore because honesty was being used against her. That was when I apologized. I apologized for doubting her. I apologized for listening to anyone else. I promised her I would do better. She hugged me like she'd been waiting for that moment. After that, she leaned into it. Not the cheating, the protection. She told me when people at work made her uncomfortable. She told me when someone crossed a line. She told me when she felt judged. Each time I responded exactly how she needed me to. I confronted people. I shut things down. I burned bridges she never had to stand on herself. I became her shield. And shields don't see what's happening behind them. The truth didn't come out all at once. It leaked. A message sent to the wrong device. A calendar entry she forgot to delete. A name that appeared too often to be coincidence. Each piece on its own was explainable. Together, they formed a shape I could no longer ignore. When I finally confronted her with everything laid out, she didn't cry. She didn't deny it. She sat very still and told me she hadn't meant for it to go on this long. That sentence ended everything. She admitted it had started months earlier. Then she corrected herself. It had actually been longer. She said it didn't mean anything at first. She said it wasn't serious. She said she never planned to leave. I asked her why she let me defend her. She said she didn't ask me to. That answer hollowed something out of me. Because she didn't have to ask. She knew I would. She told me she didn't stop me because it felt safer that way. She said as long as I believed her, everything stayed manageable. She said confrontation made things messy, and she didn't want to hurt anyone. Anyone except me. The worst part wasn't the cheating. It was realizing how much of my life I had dismantled on her behalf. Relationships I couldn't repair. Trust I had thrown away. People I had labeled cruel or jealous or bitter because it made her feel protected. I had defended a lie so completely that it erased everything else, and I had done it willingly. After she admitted it, the apartment didn't feel like a place anymore. It felt like evidence. Every room carried traces of conversations I had defended her in, arguments I had started on her behalf, phone calls I had ended because she said someone was being disrespectful. We moved around each other carefully for days, not because there was hope left, but because neither of us wanted to be the one to make the end official. She slept on the couch. I slept in the bedroom. At night, I listened to the sounds of her moving around, packing slowly, deliberately, like someone who already knew where they were going next. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was only about logistics. Who would take what? When she would come back for the rest of her things. Nothing emotional was said because it would have been dishonest at that point. When she finally left, it wasn't dramatic. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize again. She hugged me briefly, the way people do when they're trying to leave something behind without acknowledging what it was. She said she hoped I would be okay. That sentence followed me long after the door closed behind her, because it sounded like concern, and I knew better now than to trust concern when it came from her. The apartment felt larger after that, emptier in a way that made sound echo differently. I sat on the floor for a long time, not crying, not thinking, just trying to understand how quickly a life could collapse once the thing holding it together turned out to be false. The real damage didn't show itself immediately. At first, there was only silence. My phone stopped buzzing. Group chats went quiet. People I had cut off didn't reach back out, and I didn't blame them. From their perspective, I had chosen her loudly and decisively. I had dismissed them, corrected them, accused them of projecting, of being jealous, of wanting to cause trouble. I had done it with confidence, and confidence leaves a lasting impression even after it's proven wrong. When I finally tried to reconnect, I did it carefully, sending messages that didn't ask for forgiveness but didn't avoid responsibility either. Most of them were never answered. A few responses came back polite and distant, the kind that makes it clear the relationship is already over and the message is just a courtesy. At work, the consequences were quieter but just as permanent. I had defended her there too, challenged people who hinted something wasn't right, accused them of spreading rumors, of being unprofessional. When the truth came out privately, it didn't restore my standing. It reframed it. I wasn't seen as someone who had been betrayed. I was seen as someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted, someone who had been so emotionally involved that they couldn't see what was happening right in front of them. Opportunities stopped coming my way. Not officially, not in ways that could be challenged, but subtly, through reassignment, through being left out of early discussions, through decisions being made without my input. No one ever said it was because of what happened, but everything about the shift pointed back to it. The isolation set in slowly. Nights became the hardest. Not because I missed her, but because I had no one left to talk to about ordinary things. No one to send a message to when something small happened. No one to share a thought with without worrying how it might be interpreted. I replayed conversations over and over, not just the ones where she lied, but the ones where I had been so sure of myself while defending her. I remembered the tone of my voice, the certainty in my words, the way I had shut people down without listening. Those memories didn't hurt because they proved I was wrong. They hurt because they proved how willing I had been to be wrong as long as it meant preserving the relationship. Months later, I found out the cheating hadn't ended when she told me. It had ended earlier, quietly, when it stopped being convenient. That detail came from someone I used to trust, someone who had tried to warn me once, and then stepped back when I made it clear I didn't want to hear it. They didn't sound angry when they told me. They sounded resigned, like they had expected this outcome from the beginning. I thanked them for telling me and didn't ask any follow-up questions. There was nothing left to clarify. The truth had already done all the damage it was going to do. What lingered wasn't heartbreak in the traditional sense, it was something colder. A constant awareness of how easily loyalty can be exploited when someone understands your instincts better than you do. I stopped defending people automatically. I stopped trusting my first reactions. Every time someone spoke poorly about someone I cared about, I felt a hesitation I hadn't felt before. A pause where certainty used to live. That pause never went away. It became part of how I interacted with the world. A permanent delay between feeling and action. The relationship ended cleanly. There were no loose ends, no unresolved conversations, no hope of reconciliation. That part of the story is closed. But the version of me that believed defending someone was always the right thing to do didn't survive it. That version of me was dismantled piece by piece while I was busy protecting someone who knew exactly what it would cost me and let me pay it anyway. There is no recovery arc for that kind of loss. You don't get it back. You just build something quieter in its place, something more cautious, something that understands too well how betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. I defended her because I loved her. She let me do it because it was useful. That truth is settled now. Final. And it sits with me every day, Not loudly, not dramatically, just present. Like a scar you stop noticing until something brushes against it the wrong way and reminds you it never healed. The first time I felt uneasy in my own home, I didn't tell anyone. I told myself it was nothing. A sound outside the window. A gate left open that I was sure I had closed. The kind of things you notice more when you live alone, and less when you have someone else there to dismiss them for you. I didn't want to be the kind of person who jumped at shadows, so I kept it to myself and tried to move on. That was when my neighbor introduced himself. He didn't knock the first time. He caught me outside while I was bringing groceries in, smiled politely and said he'd seen me struggling with the bags. He offered to help and carried them inside without waiting for an answer. It felt abrupt, but not threatening. Friendly, even. He said he lived 2 doors down and had been there for years. He mentioned how quiet the street usually was and joked that nothing ever happened around here. The comment felt reassuring at the time. A few nights later, I heard something again. Footsteps near the side of the house. Not loud enough to be obvious, but close enough that I paused what I was doing and listened. When it stopped, I convinced myself it had been someone walking a dog or cutting through the yard. The next morning, my neighbor texted me. I hadn't given him my number. He said he noticed my porch light was on late and wanted to check if everything was okay. He said he'd seen someone walking through the area earlier and figured I might want to be aware. That was the first time the fear had a shape. From then on, he checked in regularly, always casually, always framed as concern. He mentioned break-ins that had happened a while back, though he never seemed sure exactly when. He pointed out blind spots in my yard where lights didn't reach. He suggested I vary my schedule a bit, just in case anyone was paying attention. Each comment felt reasonable on its own. Together, they made the world outside my front door feel thinner, less solid. I started noticing more things after that. The trash bin tipped over. A gate unlatched. A knock at the door late at night that stopped before I reached it. Each time something happened, he already seemed to know. He would ask if I heard it too. If I was okay. If I needed anything. He told me he worked odd hours and kept an eye on the street when most people were asleep. He said that was just the kind of neighbor he was. I believed him because I wanted to. The fear didn't start with him. That part matters. But it grew faster once he was involved, and I didn't notice that until much later. At the time, it felt like relief to have someone else validating what I was feeling. Someone who didn't tell me I was imagining things. Someone who took it seriously. He offered to walk me to my car at night. He offered to install a motion light on the side of my house. He offered to show me where previous residents had had problems before I moved in. Each offer felt helpful. Protective. Normal. I accepted more than I should have because saying no felt rude, and because having someone nearby made the nights feel quieter, even when nothing actually changed. The first time I felt something was off was when he corrected me about my own routine. He mentioned I usually left around the same time every morning and asked if I'd be gone later than usual that day. I laughed and said my schedule wasn't that predictable. He smiled and said you'd be surprised how often people don't notice their own patterns. I told myself he was just observant. After that, he seemed to know when I was home and when I wasn't. He'd check in on days I stayed out later. He'd ask if everything went okay when I came back early. I started wondering how much he could see from his place, but I dismissed the thought because it felt paranoid, and paranoia was the thing I was trying to avoid. The incidents escalated slowly. A car idling too long down the street. A figure near the fence line that vanished when I looked again. A scratch near the back door that could have been there for weeks. Each time, my neighbor was already aware. Already concerned, already offering advice. He told me to lock certain windows. He told me to keep my phone charged at night. He told me I could call him if I felt unsafe. That was when I stopped trusting my own instincts and started trusting his instead. I began planning my evenings around when he was home. I felt calmer knowing his lights were on, knowing he was awake, knowing someone else was watching. The house felt safer when I wasn't the only one paying attention. I didn't realize how much control that gave him until I caught myself checking his driveway before deciding whether to go out. The turning point came quietly. One afternoon, I got home earlier than usual. I parked down the street instead of in my driveway because something felt off and I couldn't explain why. From there, I watched my house for a few minutes. Nothing moved. No lights changed. Everything looked normal. Then I saw my neighbor step out from behind my side fence and walk back toward his place like he'd been there for a while. When I asked him about it later, he didn't deny it. He said he'd heard something near my yard and wanted to check. He said he didn't want to scare me by knocking. He said he was just making sure everything was okay. I thanked him. That night I lay awake replaying the day, trying to pinpoint when the fear had shifted from the house itself to the person standing closest to it. The realization came slowly and it made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't ignore. The things that scared me most were the things he seemed to know about first. The reassurance always followed the unease, never the other way around. I didn't know yet whether that meant anything. I just knew that the safety I felt around him was starting to feel conditional, like it depended on me continuing to need it. And for the first time since all of this started, I wondered whether the reason I didn't feel safe anymore had less to do with what was happening around my house, and more to do with who had made himself indispensable inside my fear. I didn't confront him right away. I didn't even let myself fully believe what I was starting to suspect. Instead, I did what I had learned to do over the past few weeks. I paid attention quietly. I stopped sharing details about my day. I stopped mentioning when I would be home late or leaving early. I changed small habits without telling anyone, and the strangest thing happened. The incident slowed down, but his concern didn't. He still checked in on nights when nothing had happened. He still asked if I heard anything, even when there was nothing to hear. It was like he was following a script that no longer matched the situation. That mismatch stayed with me. One evening I told him I'd be out of town for a few days. I said it casually, like an afterthought. I didn't correct him when he repeated the dates wrong. I let him believe I'd be gone longer than I planned to be. Then I stayed. I parked a few houses away and waited. The street was quiet. Normal. Hours passed without anything unusual. Then just after midnight I saw him. He walked straight up to my house. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look around. He moved like someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly how much time they had. He reached toward the side gate, the same one that had been unlatched so many times before, and opened it carefully, silently. That was the moment my fear turned solid. Not panic. Clarity. I recorded everything. I didn't go outside. I didn't shout. I stayed where I was and watched as he moved around my yard, triggering the motion light he had installed himself weeks earlier. I realized then why it had always gone off when he was nearby. Why it had never startled him. He expected it. He needed it. It was part of the pattern. When the light came on, he stepped back deliberately, just far enough to be visible from the street, but not close enough to the house to be seen clearly. Then he waited. Nothing happened. No one came outside. After a few minutes, he turned and went back to his place. The next morning, he texted me asking if everything was okay. He said he noticed my light went off late and wanted to make sure I was safe. I didn't respond. Instead, I called a local security company and asked for a consultation. I didn't mention my neighbor. I didn't frame it as an emergency. I just said I wanted independent coverage, cameras that didn't connect to anything outside my control, motion sensors I could monitor myself. The technician who came out was thorough and professional. As he walked the property, he pointed out things that made my stomach sink. Footprints where there shouldn't have been any. A pattern to the disturbances that suggested familiarity, not randomness. He didn't say the word neighbor. He didn't have to. That same day, I contacted the non-emergency police line and asked what constituted harassment or trespassing. I kept it factual. I showed them the footage, the messages, the timestamps. I didn't accuse. I asked questions. They listened differently once I stopped framing it as fear and started framing it as documentation. They spoke to him 2 days later. I wasn't there when it happened, but I saw the aftermath. He stopped looking at my house. He stopped checking in. His lights stayed off at night. The street felt quieter than it had in months, not because anything had changed, but because the background tension was gone. The manufactured noise had stopped. A week later, I was informed that he'd been warned formally and that similar complaints had been filed before. Not recently, not loudly, but enough to establish a pattern. Enough to make the intervention stick. I never spoke to him again. The fear didn't disappear overnight. That wouldn't be realistic. I still flinched at sounds for a while. I still double-checked locks. But something fundamental had shifted back into place. The fear no longer needed a narrator. It no longer arrived pre-explained. When something felt off, I trusted myself again instead of waiting for someone else to confirm it. The camera stayed. The routine stayed changed. The awareness stayed. But the dependency didn't. Weeks later, I realized something that felt like relief more than triumph. The house had never been unsafe on its own. The danger had arrived disguised as reassurance. And once that disguise was stripped away, what remained was manageable. Ordinary. Human. I didn't feel brave. I felt awake. That was the happy ending. Not the absence of fear, but the absence of someone else controlling it. I still live there. I still greet neighbors politely. I still lock my doors at night. But I no longer confuse proximity with protection or concern with care. Because the most dangerous thing I learned was that feeling safe can be staged, and the safest moment is often the one where you stop letting someone else tell you when to be afraid. The first sign something was wrong wasn't hostility, it was efficiency. Conversations ended quicker than they used to. Meetings started on time and ended early. Decisions that once involved discussion began arriving already finalized. I was still included technically, but only at the edges. The center had shifted without anyone announcing it. I told myself that was just how work evolved. Teams changed, priorities shifted, people got busy. That explanation worked, until I noticed how often my input was acknowledged but never acted on. Not rejected, just absorbed and set aside. It felt like speaking into a system that no longer needed a response. The people I worked with were not cruel. That was the problem. They were polite, friendly, careful. They asked about my weekend. They reacted appropriately to jokes. They thanked me for my time. Nothing felt confrontational enough to challenge. Nothing felt wrong enough to accuse. The discomfort lived in what wasn't happening anymore. I stopped being asked to weigh in on early drafts. I stopped being looped into planning stages. My calendar thinned without explanation. When I asked my manager if there was anything I should be concerned about, they smiled and said everything was fine. They said I was doing good work. They said the team was just streamlining communication. Streamlining felt like a word that should have reassured me. Instead, it stayed with me. The work itself didn't stop. Tasks still came in. Deadlines were still expected. But my role had shifted into something quieter, less visible, less necessary. I didn't know how to articulate that without sounding insecure, so I kept it to myself and focused on doing my job well. I believed effort would correct whatever imbalance had formed. That belief cost me everything. The email arrived late in the afternoon. It wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't even meant for me. My name was simply there, buried in the CC line like an afterthought. At first I assumed it was a mistake. Someone had replied to the wrong thread. Someone had hit reply all without checking. That happens. I almost closed it without reading. Then I saw the subject line. It referenced me directly. I read the email slowly, not because it was complicated, but because my brain resisted processing it. It was written in neutral professional language, the kind that sounds reasonable until you realize what it's doing. It outlined next steps, timelines, risk mitigation. It referred to me as a factor that needed to be handled carefully. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because my continued presence posed challenges to alignment and efficiency. There were replies beneath it. Several. All from people I worked with every day. They discussed how to transition my responsibilities without disruption, how to frame the change to avoid unnecessary questions, how to ensure compliance and documentation were clean. Someone suggested a severance package that would discourage follow-up. Someone else confirmed legal had already reviewed the approach. No one asked whether this was fair. No one asked whether I knew. One message stood out because it felt almost kind. A colleague suggested I be informed gently, given time to process, offered support resources. They said it would be best if the message came from my manager, not HR, to preserve dignity. Dignity. That was when my hands started shaking. I wasn't being fired for cause. I wasn't being accused of anything. I was being removed because it was simpler than adjusting around me, because consensus had formed elsewhere, because my role had become inconvenient. The decision had been made quietly, collaboratively, and completely without me. I scrolled further down the thread and realized how long it had been going on. Weeks, maybe longer. They had been planning this while sitting across from me in meetings, while thanking me for work, while asking how I was doing. The friendliness hadn't been fake. It had just been procedural. I closed my laptop and sat there, staring at nothing, trying to understand how a room full of people could decide the end of my career together without ever saying a word to me. There was no anger in what they wrote, no resentment, just coordination. That was the part that frightened me most. By the time my manager called me into their office the next morning, the script was already set. They used many of the same phrases I had read the night before: restructuring, fit, future direction. They said this wasn't a reflection of my performance. They said they valued my contributions. They said they hoped we could part on good terms. I nodded. I listened. I thanked them for their transparency. I didn't mention the email. They slid a document across the table. Severance terms, confidentiality clauses, non-disparagement language. Everything was prepared, clean, thoughtful, final. I signed. Not because I agreed, but because I understood something then that I hadn't before. The most terrifying decisions aren't made in anger. They're made calmly, by groups, in writing, with legal review. And once those decisions are documented, reality rearranges itself around them. I packed my things that afternoon while my coworkers avoided eye contact out of politeness, not guilt. A few wished me luck. One said they were surprised. None said they were sorry. They didn't need to be. From their perspective, this was already over. As I walked out of the building for the last time, badge deactivated, access revoked, I realized the scariest part wasn't losing my job. It was knowing that at some point, people I trusted had sat together and agreed that my absence would be easier than my presence. And then they moved on. I didn't go home right away after I left the building. I sat in my car in the parking lot with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the entrance like I was waiting for someone to run out and stop me. That didn't happen. People kept walking in and out, tapping badges that still worked, carrying coffee, laughing at phones. The system absorbed my absence instantly. That was the first thing I understood. I wasn't missed because I hadn't left a gap. They had already closed it. When I finally drove away, my phone buzzed a few times. Short messages, neutral ones. Wishing you the best. Let me know if you need a reference. Sorry it worked out this way. No one asked what happened. No one said they didn't know. Every message sounded like something written after a conclusion, not during a crisis. I realized they weren't reaching out to comfort me. They were closing their own loops. At home, I opened my laptop again, and reread the email thread. Not because I needed to understand it better, but because I needed to know if I had imagined the tone. I hadn't. It was still there. Calm, organized, professional. The most disturbing part wasn't the plan itself. It was how reasonable it all sounded. Each message made sense in isolation. Each suggestion was practical. Together they formed something irreversible. There was no moment I could point to and say, this is where it became wrong. I noticed details I hadn't seen the first time. How often my name appeared without a pronoun. How I was referred to as the situation or the transition. How responsibility for the decision was distributed so evenly that no single person owned it. The betrayal wasn't hidden. It was diluted. Over the next few weeks, the reality of what they had done settled in slowly. I applied for new roles. Interviews went well at first. My experience spoke for itself. Then references were requested. Conversations cooled. Follow-up slowed. No one said anything negative, but no one moved forward either. The silence felt familiar. It was the same quiet alignment I had felt before the email arrived, just now directed outward. One recruiter finally gave me an honest answer. Not in writing, not officially. They said my background checked out, but there were concerns about fit based on informal feedback. They wouldn't elaborate, they didn't need to. I knew exactly where it came from. The same people who had planned my exit carefully had also ensured it wouldn't look like retaliation. They hadn't ruined me loudly. They had just made sure I wasn't endorsed. I tried reaching out to one colleague I had considered a friend. I asked carefully whether there was something I should know, whether there was something being said about me that I couldn't see. They paused for a long time before responding. Then they said they thought it was better not to dig into it. They said revisiting things would only make it harder for everyone. They said the team had moved on. That sentence stayed with me. The team had moved on. From what? From me. From the inconvenience of my presence. From the risk of having to adjust. The decision had worked exactly as intended. Months passed. My savings thinned. My confidence followed. I found work eventually, but it was smaller, quieter. A step back I couldn't explain without sounding defensive. I stopped telling the story altogether. Not because it hurt too much, but because I realized it didn't matter. There was no version of it that restored what was taken. There was no appeal process for consensus. Sometimes I think about the moment my name was added to the CC line, about the split second where someone noticed and decided not to remove it. Or maybe they didn't notice at all. Either possibility is unsettling. I wonder if they knew I would read it. I wonder if they assumed I already knew. I wonder if in some small way it was meant to make things easier. Transparency after the fact. Dignity. The truth is simpler and worse. They didn't think about me at all in that moment. By the time that email existed, I was already an outcome. I still work. I still function. From the outside, nothing about my life looks broken. But something fundamental changed the day I realized how quietly a group of colleagues can agree that you are no longer worth accommodating. Not dangerous, not incompetent, just inconvenient. And inconvenience, when shared, becomes justification. The most disturbing part isn't that they planned my exit. It's that they did it together, calmly, and then went back to work. No raised voices, no guilt, no aftermath, just alignment. I wasn't fired. I was processed. And once that happens, there is no version of the story where you get to come back.